Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me tonight on the air. My name is Bree, and this hour show, I call it The Garden, because I'm hoping to plant new seeds of thought. The purpose of my show is the pursuit of truth and beauty. Well, tonight I'm going to be dealing with a little bit of a heavier topic. A few weeks ago, I already kind of did an intro addressing the idea of not turning our eyes away from the things in life that are horrific and are terrible. Because although those things may not be beautiful, and we do want to pursue beauty with our lives, they are the truth and they are the reality of our world. And when we choose to interact with them and to recognize them, put them to prayer, or choose even to help physically or with our money or our resources, well, then we're really, on one level, we're connecting with God himself, because he sees all the horrific things in the world. He doesn't turn his eye from them. He's engaged. And so we get an opportunity through recognizing even the horrible things to know God in a deeper way. Now, that doesn't always make our trials and the things that we go through in life, it's not that we would then say, oh, I'm happy I went through that, or I want to go through it again. But at least it gives a sort of a silver lining to those horrible things. So tonight, I am interviewing a very good friend of mine from Denmark. His name is Phil Clarke. He's actually British, but his mother was Danish, and so although he grew up on the British Isle, he chooses now to live in Copenhagen. I met Phil probably about 10 years ago. I think I've mentioned before that my mom and my husband and I spent some time ministering in a hippie commune in Copenhagen called Christiania, which is one of the most colorful and interesting and crazy places I've ever been to. And in the middle of this hippie commune is a little church called Christiania Kirken. And in this little church is where we met Phil Clarke for the first time. The main thing I remember was that for some reason he let us use his apartment. I think that my mom was sleeping there while he was out of town, and my husband and I were sharing our little RV. We were getting a little break from each other. And we went in, and he wasn't there when we first went in and saw his apartment. And it was full of wild and wonderful things, like a stuffed puffin and these pictures of framed butterflies and beetles and things like that. And we just walked around, and it was almost like going into the Victoria and Albert Museum and just getting to look at all of these interesting things. And we already had known Phil for a little bit at that point, but I think that our journey with him was just a continual journey of, and you also did that, and you also did that. He's a very interesting person who has done a lot of things within versatile careers. But early in his life, he was an aid worker in Africa. And Phil has written a fictional novel loosely based on those experiences as an aid worker. As an aid worker, he experienced genocide. And so that is what the book is about. I actually had to record this interview last week or a couple weeks ago because of the time difference. Phil is in Copenhagen, so he's 8 or 9 hours ahead of us. I think 9 hours ahead. So we recorded it early in the morning, my time, in the afternoon, his time. And so I'm going to play that recording for you right now. So the interview starts with Phil giving a brief summary of his debut novel. The novel is Falling Night, and you can get that on Amazon or any local bookstore. I've heard that Barnes & Noble is carrying it. It's an excellent book. I'm going to let Phil tell you the rest.
Falling Night is a novel about an aid worker in a horrific war zone in Africa, and I wrote it on the basis of my own experiences and of others who had been there. And I wrote it to describe, firstly, what really goes on in an African war zone and in the world of humanitarian aid, but also to try and explain the powers that are behind the wars that are happening.
Yes, it was extremely complex. And I found myself stumbling a little bit in writing what I wanted to ask you about the book, because there were so many topics within the topic that I could have asked you 1,000 questions probably. because you also dissect relationships, motivations, Christianity, Western Christianity, and so on and so forth. So it was a very multifaceted book, almost unlike anything I had ever read before, which is saying a lot in our very, very saturated world. And I have read a lot as well. So it was just a wonderful experience at this time in my life to take something in hand and read it that was a complete surprise. It had me on the edge of my seat the whole time. And I felt like I was growing and learning about a world that I had never grown and learned about before. So I thoroughly enjoyed this book, Phil. It was excellent.
Thanks. I mean, it is, of course, a dark book. There is some light as well, but people I know who've read it have all said that they found it harrowing, but also, as you say, enlightening and interesting and educational for learning about what goes on, things they never expected. It took over 7,000 hours to write. And as you say, there's a lot of complexity in different subplots, different thoughts and so on.
Lots and lots of subplots, which I think also made it interesting. Yeah, you could tell that it had been well edited and that a lot of thought went into it. Over 7,000 hours. Yes, that doesn't surprise me because of the complexity of the book. And I think I wrote you at some point while I was reading it that I read it as I was falling asleep and I had dreamt about this one particular scene all night long. So yes, it was harrowing, but not in a way where I would say people shouldn't read it, or it's not that I feel stained by it in some way. It definitely was harrowing in the right kind of way, with enough light and enough, let's say enough of God in it, that it was good. It was a good work.
I deliberately toned down the violence. I mean, it has very little violence is portrayed in the novel because aid workers actually see very little violence and horror themselves. The difference is that they experience it. They experience it through the people they're helping and also the general situation where they're in. There's always a threat that violence can happen and break out against them. And so when you're an aid worker, certainly my experience was, in some of the wars where I worked, was that you lived a lot of time with quite a considerable degree of fear. And I wanted to try and portray that, which I believe from what other people have said, that I've managed to do so.
Absolutely. I think so. I definitely felt the tension and the fear in the book. So the book is called Falling Night. I love that title. I felt like it briefly and poignantly described the very soul of the book. How did you come up with that wonderful title?
Initially, it had a much longer title, but when I sent the book away to an editor to review it, she asked me for the title, and then somehow the original title seemed silly. So somehow it just came. I mean, it had some of the words from the original title, but it's actually a word play because we talk in English about night falling, as in it's getting darker. But also, if something falls, it breaks down. So we have in the words falling night, both night itself descending, so the situation getting darker, but also night being overtaken, being destroyed by light.
And see, I didn't even catch that second part. I imagined something breaking, but I didn't imagine the light breaking it. That's really good. So there you go. There's the lightness that comes into the book. That's really excellent. It says in the author's note of the book that it took over 20 years to write this novel, 7,000 hours. I really admire that stick-to-itiveness. How did you find the strength to keep chugging on and keep writing and keep working on this?
Initially, I wrote the book as a way to deal with the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, that I suffered as a result of one particular war I was in Africa. And just writing down my thoughts, my experiences, helps slowly cleanse myself of what I had suffered. I give this picture of having a dirty sponge that you put into water. Then you wring out the water and you change the water and you put it back in, then you wring it out. It was a bit like that. So the initial motive was to find healing, but also I realized I had a very unique experience as an aid worker. I'd been in a genocide where my colleagues were unable to see what was going on around me. And I wanted to describe that to others. But as the writing continued, I enjoyed the process. I enjoyed this fictional world I'd created with this group of 7 quite diverse aid workers living through many different crises. And I enjoyed the process of creating language and text. But it was also an arduous process. I mean, I realised during, the 7,000 hours that my writing was initially very clumsy. And I have a tendency to write very long sentences. Was what my editor said. And breaking those down, but also trying to really precisely capture some of the thoughts that I had. That proved more challenging than I was first aware of. And also what I realised in the process was how often I would use a word and actually not properly understand its very precise meaning. And so during the process of writing the novel, I looked up a lot of words. Then I would find, that word, what I thought meant this, was not quite that. And then I would find another more precise word. So there was a lot of effort in trying to make the text crisp and precise.
I actually feel relieved to hear you say that, because I feel like I have a lot of words, and I've been through that process as well, writing and looking up and discovering, I've had a misconception about what that means all these years, or it wasn't quite as precise as it could have been. So it's nice to know that I'm not the only one who has gone through things like that. I loved hearing you say that there was joy in it, and yet it was a work. It was arduous. And I think that's just how things are that are worth doing, aren't they? You will find the joy for sure, and you will grow, but it is also going to be a lot of hard work. I think that's what we forget in our culture a little bit. We expect it to just be all joy, and most of the time it isn't.
And not only all joy, we expect it to be easy.
All ease, exactly.
It can be done in a short time. I mean, I have to admit that when I started on this process, it was kind of late 1997, early 1998. I never imagined it would take 25 years to see this book reaching completion and being published. Yeah,
of course not. You might not have done it if you'd known.
I certainly wouldn't have done it if I'd known the cost it would have required of me, and also the length of time before getting any feedback.
Yes.
Any positive feedback.
It's difficult to stay motivated, isn't it?
It is also because when you go through a process as long as this, your peers, and that can be family and friends, can actually be quite demotivating. I mean, the number of people who said to me, well, just give yourself a deadline and then work to it.
Yes.
And what I would say to them is that there was a German physicist called Heisenberg, and he came up with something called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And it's that you can know the position of an electron or its speed, but you can never know both. And when we do tasks, we can either determine the quality or how long it will take. We can never determine both. And so my, should we say, objective was to reach a quality, not to reach a certain time or date for something to be finished. And I came to realize that to reach that quality, I would never know how long it would take before I would get there. And I had to accept that. But my peers, they couldn't see that.
But see, isn't it good to have your own inner peace?
Yeah.
That just shows. It just never comes down to what other people are saying. It comes down to you and God, right? And your own inner peace. So speaking of the quality, what I particularly liked was that the characters in your book were so complex. The 7 aid workers were really interesting. And then you also included in the story Alan's backstory, and his relationship with his girlfriend Mandy was very interesting. And I feel like I rarely read characters that are so diverse, so deep. And I wondered, how did you come to have such an insight into human nature? Do you feel like it was from being in so many different cultures? Is it a talent? Were you born that way?
I think it's a gift of discernment that God's given me. It's also, I think, that I'm by nature a slightly introverted person. So my sort of standard way of dealing with people is I'm often quite quiet when I first meet them, and evaluating to know if it's safe to, should we say, venture on into a relationship. But it means that I therefore give myself time to really try and evaluate how people are. And as I mentioned before, the gift of discernment is one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And I feel I've been given that.
That's awesome. That's amazing. Do you think people can ask for that?
I think they can, but I think they have to ask with the right motives, because it's a gift that can be abused.
Absolutely. That brings me back to Alan in the book when he first arrives in Kugumbwala. Am I saying it right?
That's right, yeah.
In Kugambwala, which is the fictional nation that you created, where the aid workers live. He sits back and he evaluates all of his co-workers, and sort of on the spot, he decides whether or not he's going to be able to dive into a friendship or a relationship with them. And that's what you would do if you have that gift of discernment, because you'd be able to sort of see deeply. But from a Christian perspective, you wouldn't immediately write people off or accept them like Alan does, right? You would have to continue in love. It's just a little different, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, it's interesting because that little bit, I've had some criticism from people, saying, oh, that's really judgmental. And I think, oh, doesn't everybody do this? Evidently not.
I do it. I believe that I also have a gift of discernment, and I can quickly suss people out. And I really have had to grow as a person not to be like Alan and just decide, okay, I'm not going to be friends with you. This isn't going to happen. And I mean, to some extent, I think I still do that. I mean, we're always learning and growing, right? But I didn't read it as judgmental, and probably because that's what I would do as well. It's more just taking in the scene.
It's a very good method in a novel to quickly introduce the key characters.
Yes, that's right.
But actually, Alan gets one of them a bit wrong.
He does.
Because one of them, it turns out, a couple of them he gets a bit wrong, but the others he gets more or less spot on.
Yes, it was good. I really liked that part, actually. I liked Alan. I thought he was a great character. He was both good and bad, so very realistic. Because I think that modern authors, or take a typical Disney movie, characters tend to be painted with just one brush, don't they? But that's just not how life is. That's not true to reality.
And also, he does change. I mean, over time.
Yes, he does.
There are changes which the book records, demonstrates.
Yes, I don't want to give it away too much. But yes, he does. He changes and he grows, as anyone would in that experience. Okay, so you already mentioned that this book was based loosely on your own experiences and started off as a way of processing the PTSD. And the first chapter, you say about Alan, Alan had risked his life and liberty to come here to Kugambwala instead of staying in the safety and comfort of his home. And then I found myself reflecting on you, Phil, the author, and wondering, why did you do that? And I realized in all of our years of friendship, I don't think I've ever specifically asked you that question. What made you decide to become an aid worker and leave your safety and comfort?
In fact, there are two different questions, because the first is what made me become an aid worker, and two, what made me decide to leave safety and comfort. So let me explain. So back in 1984, we had the big Ethiopian famine, and Bob Geldof, who was the lead singer in a British pop group called the Boomtown Rats, he was so moved by what he saw. There was a BBC TV news broadcast about the famine, and you saw this awful scene of all these starving people. And Michael Burke talked about that it was like a biblical famine. And that made a huge impression. I still get cut up when I talk about it. It made a huge impression on a lot of people, including Bob Geldof. And you put together a group of about 50 pop stars, and they sang that song, Do They Know It's Christmas? And created that, should we say, group called Band Aid to do that. And that made a very big impression on me. I would have been about 17 when that happened. And so, even as a school kid, I sent money in. And when I left home, I wanted to become an engineer, but to go out and help refugees in famine situations. And I studied engineering at university. But it was very difficult to get a job with an aid agency because I didn't have any experience. And then after some years, after I left university, I actually became a tropical forest biologist. And as a result of that, I had suddenly 3 years of experience in Africa doing logistics in remote areas. I spoke fluent Swahili, and I was taken on by the big medical aid agency, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders in English, as a logistician. But when I went to do the job for the first time, and I was sent to Somalia, I didn't really understand how dangerous it would be. And I remember I went to this interview with them in Brussels, and then they said to me that I was a good candidate and that I would hear from them. And this was back in March 1994. And then in early April 1994, the Rwandan genocide broke out and people were being slaughtered. We're getting these terrible reports coming in on the news. And I remember being very frightened every time the phone would ring. because I thought I'd be sent to Rwanda. And then eventually the phone rang and it was Médecins Sans Frontières. And they said, I'd like to send you to Somalia. Now, the whole previous year I'd been out in the bush. I didn't know about Black Hawk Down and, Westerners getting kidnapped and killed. So I said yes. And then this A4 envelope arrived from Belgium. It was all briefing documents. And one of the things it said is that one of the conditions for me to go out there was that I mustn't be allergic to small arms fire. I thought it was a bit bizarre. Then it talked about how he couldn't leave the compound except with a military escort with the UN soldiers. And it all seemed somehow unreal. And then I flew off first to Belgium and then to Nairobi, capital of Kenya. And then...
Can I ask how old you were?
I was 27.
27, okay.
Mm-hmm. And I was immediately transferred to another airport called Wilson. There's the main airport in Nairobi, then there's a small one where all the kind of safari planes and aid flights go from. And we flew 2 hours across the thorn bush. And then we reached the coast of Somalia. And we could see this huge, what had been a military runway, the main airport of Kismayo. It's the second biggest city, it's a port city. And as we're landing, suddenly I see these tanks, these UN tanks around the airport terminal. And there's barbed wire, and there's earth mounds, and there's sandbags, and soldiers in blue helmets. And I suddenly realised it's really dangerous. And that really came as a shock to me. And that's actually the opening scene of Falling Night. Mm-hmm. So that describes my feelings as I landed in Kismayo at the end of April 1994.
So essentially what I'm hearing you say is this seed had been planted in you from a young age that you knew you wanted to go and help. You had been touched, you had been moved emotionally, and so you prepared your life up to this point. But it didn't really drop. The ball didn't completely drop that it was going to actually be dangerous and you would be putting your life on the line until you were there.
But then there's another side to the story. So I then had 7 months in Somalia, and it was very difficult. I mean, every male in the streets of Kismayo carried an AK-47 assault rifle. There were these pickups with huge anti-aircraft guns on the back called technicals. And there were a lot of death threats, and one of our Somali doctors was assassinated outside the hospital gate. I mean, there were a lot of things that happened. It was a very difficult time for me, and I was cooped up in that compound for 7 months. I never walked out on foot, exactly as the briefing has promised. It was only ever with a military escort. And I went back to the UK, and my mother said to me, you're really very calm. And of course, because I got back to this sort of calmness. And actually, I had been a tropical forest biologist, and there was some work I needed to complete. So I went back to Tanzania, where I'd been before, worked as a tropical forest biologist again. And then I got a 1-year grant to do a master's degree in ecology. And at the end of it, the professors offered me a PhD place. I was the person who got the highest marks on the course, even though I hadn't studied biology since I was 13. I was a natural ecologist. And yet I felt that God wanted me to go back into aid work. And I even felt that I would die on the next trip. And there was this contrasting, what you could say, is tension in me, because I knew it was my destiny and the destiny I should follow. The worst problems for me was I was in the process of completing a big book on the tropical forests of Eastern Africa, and I just wanted to get that done. I said, I can't really die until that book is done. I went out and I told Médecins Sans Frontières I'd be ready at the end of October. And then at the end of October, I was watching this news broadcast about a new war that's suddenly broken out in Eastern Congo, and that the United Nations had lost contact with over 1 million refugees who'd been chased into the forest. And I knew that's where I would end up. And that is what happened. Okay, I didn't die, but that was the most traumatic experience of my life.
Yes. And in fact, we've talked about this before. We did another podcast on that topic, so I had kind of made a decision not to dive into that too deeply, although it's very interesting, but it's probably hard to talk about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think people can look that one up.
People can look that one up. Yes, that one is on anywhere you listen to podcasts. That one you can find. The name of the podcast is 3 with the number 3 Talk Truth. And the episode is called Genocide Witness. And it's a 2-part series. Please look that up. It's very interesting and it's good. I've talked about this on the show before. It is good for us to know these things. It is not good for us to cover up our eyes and look away from them. So I encourage Christians everywhere to educate themselves and to not look away. Speaking of that, let's go to the monkey. So in the book, it's in chapter 3, maybe I don't need to reference the chapter, but there's a UN representative, a fictional UN representative named Holmberg. And the book says he, Holmberg, continued to perform like the monkey that chooses to neither see, hear, nor speak any evil. And the line took me by surprise because I always thought, one, that it was actually 3 different monkeys, and 2, I thought that it was a picture of righteousness, like where the Bible says, whatever is pure, whatever is holy, think on these things. But the way you phrased it, it really turned the monkey into a negative thing. And I thought, maybe I've never understood that monkey.
Well, you are right, Bree. It is 3 monkeys.
Oh, okay. So I wasn't so off base on the monkeys.
No, you were quite right. And it's one of those sort of little errors that creeps in when you're an author. You're trying to write A, but actually you end up writing B.
But is it an error? Because I loved how it grabbed my attention. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. And you're also right that I think in the original intention, it was about righteousness. But there's this very fine line between wanting to be righteous and then it suddenly flipping over into actually being selfish.
That's right.
In a way, I use the 3 or the 1 monkey as a metaphor of the way that people decide not to see any wrong that goes on, not to hear about it, and not to speak about it.
Yeah, to harden their hearts towards it in a way. For me, I loved that moment. It was such an aha moment for me as I was reading. I want my listeners to go and buy your book and read it. I hope I didn't just take an aha moment away from them, because that was partly what I enjoyed so much about reading it, was your perspective and your take was so different than my perspective would be, that getting those great aha moments that stretch your thinking are really precious and valuable. So that was something that I really enjoyed about it. But to follow up on the monkey, have you experienced, and I'm saying monkeys in quotes, have you experienced these kind of monkeys in the church? Probably you talked about it a lot more when you first came back from Somalia. Did you find that your brothers and sisters in Christ were apt to act like that monkey and not want to hear about it and not really want to know?
Well, no, because you see, I would never offer to talk about these things. If they asked, I would answer.
I see.
But the thing that I found was quite strange is that how nobody would ever ask.
Yes.
And so recently, a church I've been attending for many years, they asked me if I would talk a bit about myself in a podcast. And I'd been attending that church for nearly 15 years. And they'd never asked me to give any testimony, not in any of the services or any other moment. And it shows how we've departed in the Christian church largely from a culture of testimony. I believe that in the early church, it was quite a big part of the witness that was shared between the believers. And it's something that we could do better at today, because actually when you listen to people's stories, and they have to be mature. I mean, we don't want people just talking endlessly about themselves just to blow their trumpet. But people who are mature, who want to demonstrate how God has acted in their lives, these are very important stories for us to hear. And they're very encouraging and very humbling.
And humbling, yes, that's right. And that's also good for us. I feel like having been so many years on the mission field and had many different people from all over the world come to stay at my house and had the opportunity to sit and have dinner with them and hear their story, I feel so blessed. I feel like I've had a unique opportunity. Okay, so I call my radio show The Garden, and I always say that it is the pursuit of truth and beauty. And one of the most beautiful times I remember of my whole life, and I believe you were there, was when we sat in the kitchen at the little flat where the YWAM base was in Copenhagen, and we all shared songs and stories. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
It wasn't in a sense godly because it wasn't sharing testimonies, but everybody was sharing from their heart. And there was a special intimacy because you might not share those silly songs or those silly poems or stories with people because they might laugh at you, but no one was laughing. It was just really, really special. Having said that, so talking about selfishness, you mentioned people going on and on and on about themselves. That's definitely where we are as a culture. That's probably why we don't take the time to hear people's testimonies anymore. My mom and I always call Facebook Brag Book because it feels like it's just a chance to showcase, all of the great things that we've been doing and who we are. So there was a line in your book that kind of touched on this that opened up several questions for me. The line said, "Perhaps there was a need to compliment those who did well," Alan pondered, "in order to justify the Western material lifestyle, to celebrate society's collective selfishness by glorifying those who excelled in it. For, to become aware of the unmet needs of others would expose the uncomfortable truth that success is no more than determined selfishness. That phraseology there, determined selfishness, really stayed inside of me. So first of all, this is a 3-part question, so I'll go 1, 2, 3. First of all, do you feel that since our Western culture has shifted a little bit into glorifying the victim and everybody wanting to be a victim, that we're still in that same place where we only celebrate success? And is there a good middle ground between those two things?
Well, I think this glorifying victim culture that we're seeing more and more of now, it's actually about virtue signaling. A lot of these people, they don't actually want to be a victim, but they like to pretend they're taking the side of the victim because it makes them feel better about who they are. It actually justifies their success, because how can you criticize them for being successful when they are speaking on behalf of the victim? But the real question is, are they doing anything for the victims? It's all very well having opinions, but actions are what matter.
So there are a lot of very wealthy people, or maybe sort of the leaders in society a lot of times, who are actually giving a lot financially. Do you feel like that doesn't matter so much? It really matters more in time spent helping? I
think it matters in giving themselves in terms of their life. One of the things that strikes me when we wrote this passage about the determined selfishness, and it's a scene where Alan is at a meal and his mother-in-law is talking about her son, Graham, who is successful. It strikes me how often I meet people who have children, adult children, and they talk about, so-and-so has become a doctor or a lawyer or one thing after another. And actually, when you analyse the reasons for talking about that person, it's not to celebrate, let's say, that so-and-so has become a doctor so that they can heal many people. It's to celebrate that they've become a doctor so that they have become leading members of society, so that they will be secure in terms of a good income and prospects. So you can see that you can become a doctor to go and help the poor in a refugee camp, or you can be a doctor to have a good and successful life in the modern Western world and understanding. So the actual act of becoming doctor is neither good nor bad in itself. It's your motive. But when people celebrate it, it's very often they're celebrating the selfish side of that kind of deed.
I see what you're saying. So this is more about the celebration as a culture than the act of what an individual person is doing.
That's right. But there's another side to it, I think, that Christians in particular have to reflect very carefully about. And that is, what are you actually giving your life to? We spend a very considerable part of our lives in our everyday work and careers. Now, you, Bree, you gave up your life, you became a missionary, you went to a faraway country across an ocean and worked full-time in the mission field for very many years. So you know what it is to actually give your life. That's giving your life to Christ, to what God wants you to do. That's following your calling. Where sadly, I think a lot of Christians have mistaken what Christianity really is. I see many of them having careers and lives that are just the same as non-Christians. The only difference is that they are Christians by identity and by Sunday morning worship and maybe a Bible study and some other things like that. So, they are applying their Christianity in that sense. But are they really giving their lives to the Lord, taking risks for him? And sadly, I think that has dropped out of our Christian culture.
I agree with you. I think that it's hard for me to go there mentally because I don't want to be judgmental towards the people around me.
That's right. That's right.
So it's hard to know where to categorize those thoughts, if that makes sense. How do you deal with that in yourself? Because you've given more than most have given. How do you deal with not being judgmental towards, especially other Christians?
Yeah, I don't allow it to affect how I deal with any person as I talk to them and so on. But sometimes I go away thinking, isn't it sad that this person isn't or hasn't seen the beauty and the challenge of really throwing themselves into the calling that I'm sure God has for them. You see, I don't think God calls anyone to just live a life like everybody else. I think Christianity should be transformational. We should be able to see in ourselves, and others should be able to see it as well, a life that is totally different because we're Christians.
I agree. I have often pondered, what would the world look like if Christians would put more on the line? I go so far down the thought path to think, what if Christians didn't choose to have ordinary 9-to-5 jobs for their income, but just chose to trust God and be missional with their lives? What kind of miracle land would we live in?
The world would be completely different. Because one of the things I've also discovered through these many years of working both as an aid worker and later as a war crimes researcher is the remarkable effect of a few unselfish people. You see, in my kind of work, you encounter the lives of many selfish people, and they could be warlords or politicians or even journalists who report the wrong things deliberately and so on. And you come across actually very few people who really set themselves apart in terms of what they're doing. But those people, they have a huge effect.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about. I always think about David Livingstone as one of my personal heroes. That one man had a huge effect, a positive and negative, I understand, but I don't think his heart was for the negative. His heart was to carry the gospel. So to think about generations of Christians who would live that way, the world would be a different place, absolutely. But the evil stays. The evil is, in my mind, unmovable. In the end, it's going to rise up. It's going to battle us. It's going to push back. And you have seen some of the very worst of the evil. How do you deal with the questions, and I'm sure people ask you this all the time, of the goodness of God in such a dark world?
Well, I think it's the wrong way to look at it from my point of view. I mean, what I've seen is the wretchedness of man. I mean, I came out of Congo and I didn't want to be part of the human race. I was so disgusted, but I am. And I'm as bad as many other people. I'm aware that I'm selfish. Okay, I have worked as an aid worker, but today I'm not giving money to every single crisis that exists. Partly I don't have the money, but I'm just not my heart isn't burning for people in some of those areas that I wish it was. So in some ways my heart has been hardened by the reality or by the experience of living in a Western country. But going back to the goodness of God, I mean, we live in a world full of evil and sin. And one of the things that it's easy to forget is that sin has consequences. So when we do wrong, there are consequences for other people. And that is the world we live in. And one of the things that really kept me going was I saw a few individuals who, either by coincidence or whether there is something in it, all three were Catholics, who really stood out from the crowd, who really tried to do good. And they were like these little points of light shining in the darkness. And in the start of John's Gospel, it talks about the light shining out the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And I think that's a very good picture of how the world is, that there's a lot of darkness, and yet there's these little speck of light, and the darkness can't snuff it out until Jesus comes, and then he will end up snuffing out the darkness.
So how did you, having gone through all of this, did you feel like you became, I think you used the quote, adrenaline junkie, like you became an adrenaline junkie? How difficult was it to go back to everyday life after being in this intense place, in this intense experience?
I think if you've had these intense experiences, but also of the risk and the fear, then it's really easy. I mean, I love the safety. I live in Denmark. It's one of the safest countries in the world.
And one of the most beautiful countries in the world. I love Denmark.
Yeah, I mean, the landscape isn't fantastic. The city is very nice in Copenhagen, but it's just safe and easy. And wow, I really appreciate that. I mean, at times it can feel a bit unchallenging, but you find your challenges in other things.
That was my next question to you. Do you think that you, as a result of everything that you went through, naturally keep your life challenging and find ways to keep growing and learning?
I've realized I'm not a person who deals well with routine. I need to have different tasks every day and need to keep doing new things. Maybe that's just a personality I am. I don't think it's necessary as a result of having been an aid worker.
That's what I wondered, because I think I also am not a fan of routine. I struggle, now that I'm not on the mission field, with my day-to-day, very normal life. And so partly I think doing this radio show is a little bit how I'm coping with that. I'm trying to give myself something that pulls more out of me, that broadens my horizons more than the four walls of my house and my kids. But I look around me and I see that most people are pretty content with day-to-day life. I was just talking about mobile phone statistics and people spending 12.5 hours a day on a screen. That's just hard to fathom for me. And I'm not sure if that's experience lived or if it's personality. But you would say more that it's nature. People are born that way or not?
Well, I think people are born to have a need to fulfill excitement, particularly when they're young. Sadly, I think a lot of people do so through immoral or illegal activities. And there are some who find okay activities like rock climbing and mountain climbing, but there are others who perhaps get into illicit sexual relationships, and there's one of the reasons why there are lots of adulteries that go on or relationships break up, because the act of having an affair creates excitement.
Yes, I'm so surprised to find there's more adultery in the world than I had imagined when I was younger. I'm just looking at people's day-to-day life, and I'm not thinking about what they do in private. It's true that people use sin as a way to bring excitement into their life, don't they? Yes, that's a very good point. So the trick as a Christian is to discover that through fulfilling your purpose, as you said, God will give you all of that without the negative side effects, and even more, because he'll also give you joy and peace and all the fruits of the Spirit, deeper fulfillment than shopping or any of the things that we talked about can ever bring you. That's a really good point, Phil. I had not thought about people seeking excitement in those ways.
And I think that for Christians who are facing this challenge of where to find their excitement, the only way is to cast yourself out in God's hands and follow the calling he has for you. Because otherwise, if you don't do it, there's a big risk. You will be drawn into pornography or an affair or something like that. And it happens to many Christians.
It happens so often. I think that being back in America is where my eyes are kind of being opened. On the mission field, I didn't experience it quite in the same way. And I think that's because my circle of close friends were more people who had given themselves away. And even just to stand for Christ in Europe is a different proposition than standing for Christ in America. So you are a little bit more finely tuned, a little bit sharper in Europe than you are over here. And so it has been an interesting experience to come back and be in the land where there is a church on every street corner. And Klamath Falls, people feel like there's crime here, the people who live here and grew up here, but there really isn't very much. It's like Denmark. It's extremely safe. And it is so wholesome that I can't believe it. And you could easily be tricked into believing you're a Christian as a result of the general wholesome lifestyle and the good families, when in fact you've never been born again. And that's scary. That's not good. It's really, really interesting for me. So back to your book, talking about affairs and illicit relationships. You could have just focused this book on life as an aid worker, life in Africa, but you chose purposely to bring in this whole other aspect of Alan's relationship with his girlfriend, Mandy. And it's quite deep. There's a lot of details there. What made you decide to do that?
Well, one of the reasons was to show that you don't become an aid worker by yourself. What you do has an impact on those around you. And so I wanted to show how the Alan going out to become an aid worker does affect his relationship with his girlfriend, for better and for worse. And to show the struggles that a couple living apart have.
It must be very difficult. It's hard to imagine. And then he starts to change in a way that she doesn't start to change. They definitely go apart. Yeah, that makes sense. And then also, the other thing that I was very curious about that sort of struck me was that Alan's family doesn't feature as heavily in the book as Mandy's family does. Was there a reason for that?
One of the reasons was that inevitably when you're an author, people will be looking for links and comparisons. And so to protect my own family and have a very tight and loving family, I didn't want to write anything that would be construed as a criticism of any of them. And I could have written that I could have written that Alan had a very loving family, but it wouldn't have made it of a very interesting reading. And the other problem you have when you're an author is you have to limit the number of characters you have. You have to simplify the story. And so the interesting bit about Alan's background story is the relationship with Mandy and her mother and her father, rather than Alan's own parents. Although we do just right at the start see Alan meeting his father.
Yes, we see his dad gardening. And it was interesting. And Mandy and her mother were very true to life. And I had to cringe a little bit and hope that my mother and I don't treat Tilo the way that Mandy and her mother treat Alan. Because women tend to be like that a little bit, don't they? For better or for worse. So let's touch on the supernatural a little bit, because I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't ask you about one of the exciting things about Christianity in Africa is that it is a little bit more supernatural. I think, maybe you'll correct me, that it is here. There's two supernatural moments in your book. One is a Christian character having a vision from the Lord to give her peace, and the other is a demonic encounter. Is that a true picture of what you experienced? Can you share any testimonies about the supernatural?
I've actually had more demonic encounters in Europe because My parents' house had to be exorcised at one point. We were getting poltergeist activity. So I didn't need any demonic activity experience in Africa from that point of view. Although I did experience some, not as much as you might expect. And then we have Lorna, the doctor, having a vision. Somehow, I got that picture. People said it's a very beautiful vision. But I got that picture somehow. It just happened at one point. I was actually in Denmark when it happened. Yeah, did I make it? It's one of those sort of, it's such a good little vision. I'm not sure I could have made it up, or it's somehow the thought came. I see the hand of God in what happens in my life. I see that very, very strongly. So it's a kind of observation and analysis. And sometimes if I do something wrong, I will feel my conscience will tell me, it's like God saying straight away, that's bad. And
so how do you experience the supernatural from God?
I did have a very, very strong supernatural experience in Congo. It was on my last day. I talk about it in 3 Talk Truth, where I felt God spoke to me directly. I didn't include it in the novel because I felt it would have felt too supernatural for people who'd never experienced something like that. It would have been too unbelievable.
I see. Okay. Even going into the demonic, or even now just saying on this radio broadcast that your house had a poltergeist might be too much for people already. It's not too much for me, but I'm wondering what people would think. I'll have to maybe get you on again to talk about your poltergeist, because that's good to realize and to be truthful about the fact that there are demons and that they are trying to harass us. Okay, I wanted to ask you this. C.S. Lewis once said, "Talk to me about the consolation of religion, and I will think that you don't understand." So I wondered about you. Going through PTSD and seeing those things is like going through grief. Did you find consolation in your religion, or did you feel like C.S. Lewis, like someone couldn't understand if they thought that would be enough consolation?
The Christian religion and my fellow Christians, it was extremely disappointing. When I got back from Congo, no one really wanted to know. And it meant that I never really spoke about what I'd been through and some of the experiences I didn't talk about for many years. But even in addition to not being asked questions, I would have to say that Christianity as a religion has more often been a disappointment than not. Sadly, I find Christians as a generality to be more shallow than I'd like. I find it quite difficult. You and your mother and Tilo are among the few really genuine Christian friends I have, even though I have been a regular churchgoer all my life. I don't know why that is. Maybe there's something wrong with me. I remember once I was a member of a cell group. For those who don't know, it's a group of Christians who meet, let's say, every 2 weeks or something and discuss their lives. And there was one particular moment where I told them about a niece who was dying of cancer. And it was something that was very difficult for me, and I needed some consolation and so on. And we talked about it that evening, but no one ever asked me about it again. And, that was a process of 2 years of watching a poor little niece die slowly of cancer. So I do think the Christians could be better at being a bit less self-orientated, thinking a bit more about other Christians. So that answers that side of the religion as a consolation. In terms of faith, people have asked me whether I was angry with God after having been through a genocide. It was quite a surprising question for me because I never have been. To me, why should I be angry with God? It wasn't God who did it. Then people say, well, why did God allow it? Well, I know God has given us free will. And so what I experienced was what happens when man can run riot with their own free will and all the evil that happens. And I came to learn later of all the people who had been complicit in one way or another. They would have known what was going on, but they decided to turn away or keep their mouths shut or close their eyes, just like the 3 monkeys. What the experience did for me, it really underlined for me how wretched man is. There is no good in us as a people in general, and how much we need Jesus as our saviour. And I also had this experience in Congo. I don't know whether it was something I thought up. I don't really remember particularly a moment of a flash of vision on my inward eye, but I have this image of seeing Jesus there on the cross and looking over Congo and looking over all that suffering. And I realised that when Jesus hung on the cross, it wasn't just the physical pain of being whipped or having nails driven into his ankles and his hands, the crown of thorns pulled over his head. not even of being spat upon by the soldiers and laughed at and so on. But I believe that as Jesus hung on the cross, he saw all the sin and all the suffering in the world in all time. And the pain of bearing that must have been indescribable. And when I was in Congo, I just got a little pinprick of a thorn, perhaps, like the crown of thorns, of that pain. And that was unbearable for me. But what Jesus would have gone through would have been quite indescribable.
And he went to it willingly because he loved us so much. It's hard to even imagine that kind of love for us. That you got to have that peek into sharing that suffering with him is very, very precious. And I think when I talked about that before, I did another episode where I talked about not turning your eye away from human suffering. And that's the biggest thing. If you experience human suffering, you are going deeper with God. God experiences human suffering. He doesn't think it's all wonderful. I mean, he knows the darkness that we can't even fathom. And when we experience it and don't choose to look away, we go to a different place with him in our relationship. I guess you could say maturity in a way, but we share with him. And I know that God is longing to share with us and have that kind of intimacy with us. So in a sense, even though it's hard and horrible, we're really gypping ourselves if we refuse, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I'm not 100% sure I'd want to do it again. I mean, the hardest bit for me in Congo was actually that it was like God was absent. I had this experience where I met a Catholic priest. He was from France. He was going into the forest to rescue these refugees who were being slaughtered there. And at some moment he had to evacuate, and it was like that the light that was shining out in the darkness was extinguished. And for the next many months, I saw no light, and it was utterly dark. And when I kind of go back through my memory of that time, it's just this old blackness. I mean, of course, I do remember some incidents, but the memory block, as it were, is sort of black. And I really struggled, where was God? And one of our local staff, he called himself a pastor, and he was kind of quite nasty to me. And it was just sort of, all these experiences just making it worse. And then shortly before I left, I didn't know when I was going to leave so quickly. I was, in fact, evacuated 3 times, and the last time was the final time. I was at a church service, and a Catholic priest said, you are the witness, he said, addressing the congregation. You must speak out. And that was the first sort of glimmer of light that he was willing to say that effectively in public. And then I had an experience where God spoke directly to me, and I was evacuated straight afterwards. But what was very interesting was that when God spoke, the question I'd asked, where was God, was totally irrelevant. And it was a bit like that at the end of Job, when Job is effectively asking God all these things about why do you allow evil to happen and so on. And then God describes, were you there at the creation? And it basically says there's a much more that goes on in the world than you could ever imagine. And that effectively what God is saying, that's my interpretation, is that the answer is beyond you to understand. And then Job just realizes that, it's just, he's crying out for God has been the wrong thing to do. It's actually been quite, in some ways, selfish, I think.
What should he have been doing?
Well,
what has God revealed to you? Has God spoken to you about that?
I mean, Job did do the right thing, is that he refused to curse God.
That's right. He also refused to take the blame for it all.
That's right. But I think that, I don't know what Job should have done, but the way I see it now is that we've just got to be more humble when we face suffering, but we just don't know why. And it's not about knowing why or trying to explain it, but what are you going to do about it? That's the issue.
That's a good word. I like the word humble to cap all of that off. Because we are often trying to judge God, judge what is right and what is the correct path for humanity. And I'm not saying that we can't see what is good and what is not good. We can. We're able to. But ultimately, we can't say to God, where have you been? Do you know what I mean? That does show a lack of humility.
Well, the problem is, you see, is that we're trying to create God in our own image.
That's right. We sure do. We try to think that we have such a depth of understanding that we could say this is how it should be. We don't have that depth of understanding at all. Not even a drop of it. Towards the end of the book, things are very bleak, and Alan is rightly despondent. It seems that all of his efforts have been in vain, and he thinks to himself how foolish it has all been, that we did all of this and it's been in vain. But then he concludes that the crux of the matter is obeying God. And he says, obeying God is more important than the results it might achieve. That was very tough for my Western mind let's just say, very tough for my Christian mind. I was wondering if you could expound on that thought a little bit.
Well, I think one of the problems is that the results are, of course, only the results we see. If we measure our effort by the results we produce, we get a very one-sided, one-dimensional view of what we're actually doing. You see, our effect on other people can be beyond what we can imagine. We don't know what effect we do have. And also, our effect may well last beyond the term of our natural lives. At the end of the day, it's more important to serve God and be obedient to what He wants us to do than to do things and try and adjust what we're doing according to the results that we see. And I'll give you an example of where you might see that. We know that in our Western culture that mega churches are really in fashion. Now, you could say, what a fantastic result that pastor whatever has 1,000 people in their congregation. But actually, that pastor may be blocking for other people to have pastored smaller groups and much more deeply than is actually happening. Because that pastor has created a church system that encourages a huge gathering where people are not having the close personal contact that I believe the early church was designed to have. An apparent positive result is, in fact, in my estimation of that example, a negative one. We don't.
Right. So in some sense, we don't even have the ability to measure the results. Or again, we just measure them through the lens of our culture, our own experience, and our own decisions about what is good and bad. So what would be the point, really, in thinking about them when our focus should be on our relationship with God, that we are hearing Him, that we are upright, and that we are obedient to what He's telling us? Some people would ask, how do you hear God? How do you know what He's calling you to?
My personal experience, I don't get visions, and I occasionally get words, but they would usually be for other people. I get a sort of sense that where God is wanting me to go. As I mentioned before, that it was looking at what happens around me. And I felt that guidance really from I was in my late teens. And sometimes I will try something 3 times, let's say, and if it fails, I feel, okay, then God didn't want me to do that. But it does vary from situation to situation. And of course, I'm always worried that I'm not hearing God properly.
I think everybody worries about that, don't we? That we're not quite there. But the best that we can do is keep trying, honestly striving after hearing Him. So you gave your life to the Lord when you were quite young then?
Well, again, you see, I was brought up as a Christian. I haven't had a road to Damascus experience. I mean, I've attended church throughout my life, and it's been a gradual process. And I can see that God has done things in my life. And really from quite early on in my adult life, I could spot the hand of God in my life.
A lot of people tell me that testimony.
Yes. And when having spotted the hand of God, then I feel, yes, then I'm supposed to take that option rather than another one. But what I've also noticed is that sometimes those acts of God do follow the decision to make a moral decision. And I'll give you an example of how I came into aid work. I've been working 3 years in Tanzania as a tropical forest biologist. And I worked for an organisation that was really quite corrupt. It was owned by a person in London who was making a lot of money out of people who are willing to go out and volunteer to do tropical forest research. And she bought a large house, and she sent her kids to private school and so on. And because I was in the leadership, I was the coordinator of the tropical forest program, I knew how little money we were receiving compared to how much these volunteers were paying to go out. And I realized I was kind of complicit in this, even though I wasn't benefiting myself. I was earning in those days a salary of not much more than $250 a month. That was back in the early 90s. But I was complicit, and so I decided I would have to leave. And then one evening in a bar in Dar es Salaam, myself and a colleague, we meet these 2 people from Médecins Sans Frontières, the organisation I came to work for. And they had come out because there'd been some massacres in Burundi, which is a neighbouring country to Tanzania. And therefore they were having to set up a whole supply line to reach the refugee camps. from the coast. And they were looking for a place to rent. And this person who owned the organisation that I worked for, who was always looking for ways to save even more money so she could have more for herself, she told us to rent half of our building out. And so here suddenly they were looking for a place and we were looking for somebody to rent to. And then they moved in, and suddenly this very dynamic aid agency was there, in my house. And even more amazing, they had an administrator who I didn't think was particularly able. And I thought, well, if he could do this job, so could I. So he gave me a contact address in Brussels, and then when I got back to the UK, I contacted them. And I remember that 6 months before, on one of my last expeditions, we'd had 2 French people who'd come out, and they talked about this organisation, Médecins Sans Frontières, who I vaguely remembered from my youth when I was at university. And so, you see, God had been priming me, so that when they came, oh yes, I had actually heard of them. But we can see that I'd made that decision that I was going to have to leave because I was somehow complicit. And then I think God honoured that by providing the next opportunity. And then I took that opportunity because I saw I felt that was what God wanted me to do.
You are listening to KTEC 89.5 FM in Klamath Falls. Just a little break from my interview with Phil there to say that. And now I'm going to go ahead and get him going again. Thank you so much for listening. So that brings me to that aspect of your book, that the book is quite critical of the aid society that Alan is working for. And I know that you had been the director for, I'm just going to say Doctors Without Borders because I can't say it in French, that you had been the director for them in Copenhagen. And I thought, was he being critical of himself? But then they must be that they're run very differently, the different organizations. Médecins
Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, was definitely one of the better aid agencies. And I used to say to people that maybe 20% of the people who work for that organization were really dedicated humanitarians, whereas in most other organizations, I felt it was only 2 to 5%.
Oh, and even 20% sounds low, doesn't it?
I have to say that from my own evaluation, I found a lot of my colleagues were also quite selfish in their own way, whether it was their careers, whether it was to have an exciting time abroad, to benefit from the good name of the organisation. But there were some really amazing people in that organisation who I will forever admire.
That was really interesting because from an outside perspective, you wouldn't imagine ways that people could be selfish when they're becoming aid workers, or I never did. And the book really highlights that well, even especially within the UN, where there's a lot of career boosting and places that my mind just hadn't gone before when I thought about it.
And huge salaries, absolutely huge salaries. I mean, I find it unbelievable that people can accept such large salaries while working alongside a local colleague who earns less than 1% of what they're earning. And they're facing the same danger.
Yeah, you would want to give and give and give, right? Wouldn't you? In a way. Yeah. You just said that you were evacuated 3 times, and Alan is evacuated in the book at one point, and he has to leave behind all those co-workers, native co-workers that he had bonded with to some extent. How do you deal with the survivor's guilt of that?
I think that because I'd chosen to go in, therefore, I'm less of a survivor guilt situation than other people. You see, if I had survived a war and my family members had not, then we would have entered that war on the same basis. Do you see what I mean? But because I chose to go in and then I was evacuated, then somehow it didn't touch me. I was separate from it. I was a volunteer, you see, in. And I would just to add on to the last point, our salaries in Médecins Sans Frontières were significantly lower than the UN or many of the other aid agencies, which I think is why we had better quality staff. And I believe that if the UN reduced its salaries by half to a third, you'd see a much better organisation and save a lot more money. There's a lot more money to the beneficiaries.
Right, which is always the frustration, isn't it? That they're not getting what they should be getting. I think we are a little bit aware of that. Some Hollywood movies and things have kind of brought that to light, that the money isn't really funneling down to where it should funnel down to. So this book is a cliffhanger. It ends where we're still a little bit of a question mark about what's going to happen next. So I absolutely need to know if part 2 is in the works or if it's already finished.
Very much so. It's quite close to being finished, but I do need a bit more time on it.
Okay, But it's quite close. That's good news to me. I hate waiting forever.
And it's amazing. It's a much better book than this one.
Oh,
Part 2.
That's a big sell.
Way better.
Because I thought this book was excellent. That's a big sell. All right. So, Phil, where can my listeners buy your book?
Obviously, it is sold by Amazon, but also Barnes & Noble, I think, they have it, and other bookshops like in the UK, Foyles, Blackstone. Yeah, if you Google, you'll see lots of people are carrying the book on their shelves at the moment. Maybe not very many on actual bookshelves, physical bookshelves. That needs to change, but hopefully if sales pick up, then that will happen.
So there you go, people. Listen to the voice of God tonight. I would definitely recommend reading this book. I thought it was excellent. If you're a reader at all, or even if you're not a reader, I actually think if you're not a reader, this book could still be for you. And I also think a lot of the books these days tend to be quite womanly. This is definitely a book that a man could also read and enjoy. It has a man's pace to it. So we have a Barnes & Nobles. I think that's our nearest bookstore. It's in Medford, or shop on Amazon, as all Klamath Falls people do. The book is Falling Night by Phil Clarke, and Clarke is spelled with an E, Clarke. Phil, thank you so much for giving me your time today. I really, really enjoyed it. I have always appreciated about you, and even this morning appreciated you give me such a different perspective on things. You take my mind where it hadn't been before, and that is so refreshing in a world that tends to be so samey all the time. Oh, what's next for you? What's next for you, Phil? You've had this wonderfully diverse career.
Well, I'm still trying to promote the novel.
So for the foreseeable future, it's novel promotion.
Having spent so much time on it, I feel I need to give it the sort of chance to get the word out there about it.
Absolutely. I agree.
But also because I feel that it has a very important message for people to read.
It does. I second that. That's right. That's not just from the author. I totally agree. It does. So check out Falling Night at Barnes & Noble or on Amazon, Falling Night by Phil Clarke. Check out our other podcast where we dive in more into the topic of genocide. That's on 3 with the number 3 Talk Truth, anywhere that you can find podcasts. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, listeners. And until next week, ladies and gentlemen, may our hearts and minds be fertile ground. And if you want to drop me an email, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. My email address is Bree, which is just BRE, at diversebreakthrough.com. That's Bree, BRE, at diverse, DIVERSE, break, BREAK, through, THROUGH.com. Bree at diversebreakthrough.com. Always a pleasure. Next week, God willing, I'm going to be interviewing a Oregon State trooper turned youth director. So I think that's going to be very interesting. And the topic of the radio show is going to be yourself, which I think is something that we often all need a little bit of help with. Insecurity runs deep, doesn't it? So until next week, may our hearts and minds be fertile ground. I hope you have a great evening. And again, thank you so much for listening. And thank you so much to Phil for sharing his wonderful insights with us. I enjoyed listening to it all over again, and I hope that you did too. Good night.